There was a time when the world looked at the Arabian Peninsula with a mix of disdain and mystery. There, among endless dunes and a cloudless sky, stretched a fragmented land inhabited by nomadic tribes, ever-moving caravans, and isolated oasis cities that survived through trade, oral poetry, and ancient codes of honor. 7th century Arabia was not the center of empires, but a corridor of sands through which stories, spices, and ancestral silences passed. The Roman world was already in decline in the west, and the Byzantine Empire was locked in bitter struggles with the Sassanid Persians to the north. To the south, the dunes slept, forgotten by the great powers, until a voice rose among them, a voice that would change everything. In the city of Mecca, a bustling trade hub, and yet deeply spiritual, lived a man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah. Orphaned from a young age, he was raised by his grandfather and later by his uncle. Still a young man, he earned a reputation as a man of integrity and trustworthiness, earning him the nickname Al-Amin, the trustworthy. He became a respected merchant, and upon marrying Khadija, a wealthy widow, he found not only financial stability, but also emotional and intellectual support. It was in his reflective solitude, in the silence of nearby caves, that Muhammad sought answers. He felt restless, touched by something he could not yet understand. And it was there, in the hidden recess of the cave of Hira, that destiny bowed to time. According to Islamic tradition, it was on the night called Laylat al-Qadr, the night of destiny, that the angel Gabriel appeared to Muhammad with a single command: Iqra, read. Frightened and confused, Muhammad hesitated, but the divine command echoed again. It was the beginning of the revelation of the Quran, the word of God delivered to an illiterate man who would never write, but would speak with the force of faith and truth. The message was clear, revolutionary, and deeply challenging to the tribal order. One God, one Creator, one Lord of all worlds, Allah. Gradually, Muhammad began to share his revelations with those closest to him. First, his wife, then his cousin Ali, his friend Abu Bakr, and a few other brave souls. But the message of monotheism, of social justice, of equality and compassion met fierce resistance from the leaders of Mecca, whose economy and prestige were rooted in idolatry, tribal cults, and the polytheistic pilgrimage to the Kaaba. Conflict was inevitable. The new prophet was seen as a threat to the established order. For more than a decade, Muhammad and his followers were persecuted, insulted, attacked, yet faith grew. Slowly, Islam began to break through tribal barriers, uniting men and women from different lineages under the invisible banner of a common belief. In 622, faced with escalating violence, Muhammad undertook the Hijra, the migration, to the city of Yathrib, which would come to be known as Medina, the city of the Prophet. This event would mark the beginning of the Islamic calendar and would symbolize more than a flight. It represented the birth of a community, the Ummah. In Medina, Muhammad was not only a spiritual leader, he also became a head of state, a strategist, a lawgiver. He forged alliances with Jewish and Arab tribes, promoted social reforms, and led decisive battles. Islam was no longer just a faith, it was becoming a rising political force. In the years that followed, conflicts with Mecca continued, culminating in the conquest of Mecca in 630, when Muhammad returned to his hometown not as a fugitive, but as a conqueror, and forgave his enemies. The Kaaba was cleansed of idols and consecrated to the worship of Allah. A new era was beginning. When Muhammad passed away in 632 at the age of 63, he left behind a transformed Arabia. Tribes once hostile now found themselves united by a common faith. The Quran had been fully revealed, and his companions, the Sahaba, were ready to carry on the mission. But one question loomed like a shadow over that dawn: who would lead now? With the Prophet's death, not only a man was gone, a vacuum was born, and so was the seed of a structure that would change the world forever: the Caliphate. From the silence of the dunes to the strength of a new civilization, the journey was only beginning. And in the coming hours of our voyage, we will dive deep into the heart of the conquests, the disputes, the alliances, and the ideas that shaped centuries of history. a story told by swords and scrolls, by faith and fire, by sacred words and sands in eternal motion. The death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 was not merely the end of a life, it was the beginning of an uncertain and turbulent era. For those who believed he was the seal of the prophets, the final messenger of God, his departure left a spiritual and political void that seemed impossible to fill. His followers, men and women who had given up everything for their faith, now found themselves orphaned, guided only by the memory of his voice, the echo of his actions, and the words of the Quran. The Islamic world, still in its infancy, was gasping between grief and the urgent need for continuity. It was in this moment of vulnerability that the figure of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Muhammad's closest friend and confidant, emerged with the composure the situation demanded. With calm authority, he uttered words that would be etched in history. Whoever worships Muhammad, know that Muhammad is dead. But whoever worships Allah, know that Allah is eternal and never dies. It was a call to reason, to pure faith, free from idolatry and anchored in transcendence. Abu Bakr was then chosen as the first caliph, a word meaning successor, not as a prophet, but as the leader of the community of believers, the Qabani Ummah. His rule was brief but decisive. Abu Bakr immediately faced a wave of internal revolts known as the Marida Wars, or the Wars of Apostasy. Many tribes that had sworn allegiance to Muhammad saw the alliance as ended with his death, but Abu Bakr acted with unwavering resolve. He affirmed that faith in Allah and allegiance to the Ummah were not personal contracts, but eternal commitments. He dispatched armies that soon reconquered the rebellious tribes and reaffirmed Islamic unity. With internal stability restored, Abu Bakr began what would forever change the known world, the first military campaigns beyond the Arabian Peninsula, directed at the two giants surrounding the nascent Muslim world, the Sassanid Empire to the east and the Byzantine Empire to the west. It was the beginning of an expansion driven not just by territorial ambition, but by the power of an idea, the fervor of a new faith, and the sense of divine mission carried by a people who believed they were fulfilling sacred destiny. After Abu Bakr's death in 634, the caliphate passed to Umar ibn al-Khattab, a man of austerity, strength, wisdom, and deep devotion. Under his leadership, the caliphate experienced a dramatic transformation, not only in territorial growth, but also in administrative structure and social justice. Umar implemented the first systems of civil governance, fair taxation, population census, and the Diwan, official registers of soldiers and stipends. These were the seeds of an organized empire still guided by spiritual values. Perhaps the most striking legacy of Umar's caliphate was the explosive territorial expansion. Under his command, the Arab world witnessed the collapse of the mighty Sassanid Empire and the loss of vast Byzantine territories. Cities like Damascus, Jerusalem, Ctesiphon, Aleppo, and Alexandria, once distant and untouchable, were now part of the growing map of the Ummah. And yet, in the face of military triumph, Umar lived a life of simplicity. His patched robe, his unguarded walks, his rejection of luxury stood in sharp contrast to the empires that crumbled before his sword. He was a living embodiment of Islamic justice. Umar was assassinated in 644 by a Persian slave. The community then selected Uthman ibn Affan as the third caliph, a generous man from an influential family with notable administrative skills. Under his rule, the Islamic Empire consolidated its borders and experienced considerable prosperity. Yet it also began to show signs of internal strain. It was during Uthman's rule that the Quran was compiled into a single, standardized version, distributed to ensure consistent recitation and preserve the revelation in its purest form. This act would secure the sacred text's integrity for centuries and remains a foundational milestone in Islamic history. But Uthman's reign was not without turmoil. Accusations of nepotism, regional uprisings, and simmering tribal tensions began to surface. His centralization of power and the appointment of relatives to key positions sparked resentment among various groups. In 656, a group of dissidents surrounded his home in Medina. After days of standoff, the caliph was brutally murdered while reading the Quran. His blood staining the sacred pages became a haunting symbol of the division to come. With Uthman's death, the caliphate plunged into its first civil war. Ali ibn Abi Talib, cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet, was chosen as successor. Known for his wisdom, courage, and piety, many believed he should have been caliph from the beginning. Yet his leadership was immediately contested by factions demanding justice for Uthman's murder. What followed were the battles of Jamal and Siffin, marked by fratricide and spiritual wounds. Ali himself was assassinated in 1661 by a radical sect known as the Khawarij, bringing an end to the era of the rightly guided caliphs, the Rashidun. This brief period, less than 3 decades, laid the political, spiritual, and military foundations of the Islamic world. But it also sowed the seeds of a division that would echo through the centuries, the split between Sunnis and Shiites, born from the question of legitimate leadership and the role of the Prophet's family in guiding the Ummah. It was the start of a new chapter, an empire growing at lightning speed, yet beginning to fracture from within. And still, the sands of history continued to shift, carrying the banner of Islam beyond the desert, into the heart of ancient empires. The caliphate did not die with Ali. On the contrary, it would rise again, stronger, more political, more imperial. And in the next step of this sleeping journey, we will explore the conquests of Persia and the Levant, where faith met armies and where ancient cities were transformed under the crescent moon's light. When Arab armies began crossing the borders of empires that had dominated the known world for centuries, many observers of the time asked, how could a people from the sands, with no imperial tradition, no grand cavalry, no advanced siege machines, dare to challenge the might of the Sassanids and Byzantines? The answer, however, did not lie solely in swords or numbers. It was rooted in belief, in discipline forged by the desert, and in the unshakable conviction that they were fulfilling not merely a political or military mission, but a spiritual calling. The expansion of Islam was not just a series of battles. It was the collision between ancient worlds and a new order driven by faith, identity, and destiny. The first great front of battle opened in the east against the Sassanid Empire, one of Rome's oldest and proudest rivals. The Persian civilization, heir to the Achaemenid and Parthian empires, had a refined culture, a well-developed bureaucracy, a state religion, Zoroastrianism, and formidable armies. Yet by the early 7th century, it was weakened. Exhausting wars with Byzantium had drained its resources and divided its elite. Succession crises eroded the center of power. It was in this context that the Muslim general Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas marched into the heart of Persia, bringing with him not only warriors, but the certainty that they were about to fulfill the promise of expansion made by Allah and foretold by the Prophet. The decisive clash occurred along the banks of the Euphrates River on the plains of Guan Qadisiyah in 636. There, in open terrain, the two worlds collided with fury and fervor. On one side, the Sassanids, with their war elephants, heavy cavalry, seasoned officers, and elaborate strategies. On the other, the Muslims, faster, more motivated, and united by a spiritual purpose. For days, the battle raged under the scorching sun until the elephants were scattered, Persian commanders fell, and enemy morale collapsed. The path to the capital was open. The legendary city of Shah Ctesiphon, the crown of the Eastern world, fell soon after. The Persian Empire, once a pillar of civilization, crumbled before a rising power born of the desert. With the fall of the Sassanids, many thought the expansion would cease, but the West also called. Across the frontier stood the Byzantine Empire, heir to the Roman world, still holding fortresses and provinces in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Emperor Heraclius, who had reclaimed Jerusalem from the Persians years earlier, now faced a new, unexpected threat, one fueled by faith and precision. Muslim troops, led by commanders like Khalid ibn al-Walid, known as the Sword of Allah, and Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, advanced into Syria and Palestine with remarkable speed and strategy. Cities were besieged, but not razed. It was common practice upon surrender to offer protection in exchange for the jizyas, attacks. Jews and Christians, weary of Byzantine taxation and religious persecution, often welcomed the Muslims not as invaders, but as liberators. In 637, after a skillful campaign, Muslim forces arrived at the gates of Saum, Jerusalem. The holy city, long a focus of dreams and conflict, was handed over without a fight. Patriarch Sophronius insisted the surrender be made to the caliph himself. Thus, Umar ibn al-Khattab traveled personally from Medina. Refusing luxurious attire, entering the city in simple garments, praying outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to avoid turning it into a mosque, Umar left a deep imprint on the city's memory. A treaty of protection was signed, the Pact of Umar, ensuring safety for Christians and respect for their holy sites. It marked the birth of a new model of religious and political coexistence in the Middle East. But the battles were not yet over. On the plains of Yarmouk, in 636, the Muslim army faced the Byzantine forces in one of the most decisive clashes in history. Under Khalid ibn al-Walid's leadership, despite being outnumbered, the Muslims used the terrain to their advantage, ambushed enemy divisions, and broke their formation with coordinated assaults. The hot wind, the dust, the thunder of hooves, and the cries of souls in battle blended into a 6-day crescendo. By the end, the Byzantines were defeated, and Syria was irreversibly part of the Caliphate. As the expansion solidified, Muslims did not merely conquer, they absorbed cultures, preserved libraries, respected administrative systems, and often allowed local populations to keep their customs and faiths, provided they accepted the new political authority and paid the tribute. Islamic expansion was not synonymous with mass forced conversions, but with a rule that, more often than not, imposed itself through the stability it offered. In regions weary of war, taxes, and repression, the order brought by the Caliphate felt almost like relief. By the end of Umar's Caliphate, and even during Uthman's, the world map had changed dramatically. The Levantar, Mesopotamia, Persia, and parts of Egypt now stood under the crescent moon. A new empire had emerged, forged in battle, sealed by faith. And though internal tensions were beginning to surface, externally, the Islamic world seemed unstoppable. The desert had conquered the valley. The Bedouins had overcome millennia-old empires. And on the horizon, a new age was unfolding. An age where political power would take dynastic form, and the Caliphate would also become an empire. In the next chapter of our journey, we will cross the Nile and the sands of the Sahara to uncover how Islam reached the heart of North Africa, transforming cities, languages, and entire cultures forever. The wind that blew from the desert knew no borders. Having conquered Persia, the Levant, and Syria, the gaze of the Caliphate now turned westward, where the sun sank into the golden horizon of ancient lands. Egypt, with its pharaonic legacy, agricultural wealth, and strategic position between Africa and Asia, was a prize long coveted by empires. From Alexander to Rome to Byzantium, the Nile Valley was considered an invaluable jewel. But there, among irrigated fields and ancestral ruins, a new transformation was approaching. And with it, Islam would extend its reach to the shores of the Mediterranean, paving the way for one of the most enduring chapters of its history, the Muslim presence in North Africa. Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, during his rule, authorized the campaign into Egypt under the command of Amr ibn al-As, a skilled strategist with deep knowledge of the region. In 639, with a relatively small force, Amr crossed the Sinai and advanced along the eastern desert routes. But contrary to expectation, it wasn't brute force that secured his victories. It was cunning, diplomacy, and the ability to win hearts and minds. Byzantine Egypt was burdened by heavy taxation, and the Coptic population, the country's native Christians, suffered religious persecution from the empire. Many Egyptians saw in the Muslims not a force of conquest, but a promise of relief. The fortress city of Babylon, near modern-day Cairo, was one of the first major obstacles. Protected by walls and the Nile's waters, it resisted for months before surrendering under prolonged siege and political pressure. After its capitulation, Amr granted the Copts the right to retain their faith, churches, and clergy in exchange for tribute, the Shizya policy. which became a hallmark of Muslim governance in newly acquired territories. It was more than an economic strategy. It was a way to pacify lands without destroying their social fabric. Eventually, Muslim control reached Alexandria, the legendary city of Alexander, once a beacon of ancient knowledge. Its capture meant not only political control of Egypt, but access to one of the Mediterranean's key maritime gateways. After intense negotiations and intermittent fighting, Alexandria surrendered in 642, marking the end of Byzantine rule in Egypt. General Amr established a new seat of power, the city of Fustat, the seed of what would become Cairo, the Islamic capital of Egypt for centuries. Egypt quickly became a vital province of the Caliphate. Its fertile lands fed the expanding empire, its trade routes linked east and west, and its diverse population became part of a new cultural ecosystem. Contrary to popular belief, Arabic was not immediately imposed. For decades, Greek and Coptic remained in administrative use, and conversions to Islam occurred gradually, often over generations. This was the policy of pragmatic continuity, a hallmark of Muslim expansion. To conquer without dismantling, to govern without erasing, to integrate without destroying. From Egypt, expansion into Faish, North Africa, followed naturally. The Fam Berber tribes, native inhabitants of the lands we now know as Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, lived under sporadic Byzantine influence, but retained strong autonomy, rooted in their traditions, languages, and resistance. The arrival of Islam was met with both embrace and defiance. In some areas, local leaders converted and allied with the Arabs. In others, fierce resistance and prolonged rebellion erupted. During the Umayyad Caliphate, the campaign in the Maghreb, the western part of the Arab world, intensified. It was led by generals such as Uqba ibn Nafi, who founded the city of Kairouan in present-day Tunisia in 670. This city would become one of the most important religious and cultural centers of North Africa, symbolizing the growing Islamization and the fusion of local traditions with the new faith. Mosques were built, schools were established, and the seeds of a new society began to sprout. Yet not all was peaceful. One of the most iconic episodes of this era was the resistance led by a legendary Berber figure, Kahina, a warrior queen who united tribes against Arab expansion. Described in various accounts as Jewish or pagan, she was defined by her courage and military acumen. For years, she resisted the Muslim advance, delivering major defeats to the invaders. Only after her death was Berber resistance subdued and the path to the Atlantic cleared. Over time, the Berbers themselves embraced Islam, and more than that, they became key agents of its expansion, rising as soldiers, governors, merchants, and religious leaders. It would be they who, later on, would cross the Strait of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula, beginning the extraordinary story of Al-Andalus. But before that, North Africa became firmly rooted in the Islamic world, not as a distant province, but as a bridge between continents, cultures, and epochs. The conquest of Egypt and North Africa was not just territorial expansion. It was a profound transformation of an ancient world, where Islam found new forms of expression, new languages, new trade routes, and new allies. The African sands that once witnessed the reign of pharaohs and the dominance of Rome now echoed with the call to prayer. And with that call, Islam prepared to cross the waters toward the distant west, where new lands awaited its arrival, new cultures awaited its fusion, and new stories awaited their telling. In the next chapter of this sleeping journey, we will follow the epic of the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, where Islam met Europe and Al-Andalus was born, a dream woven among palm trees and palaces, swords and poetry. When the light of the era of the rightly guided caliphs faded with the assassination of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Islamic world, still young, yet already vast and multicultural, found itself at a crossroads. The ideal of communal and elected leadership, forged in the sands of Medina, began to give way to a new form of power, dynastic, centralized, and imperial. It was the dawn of the Umayyad Caliphate, a time marked by both territorial expansion and internal conflict, by splendor and tension, by monumental achievements and deep fractures. The echoes of this period still reverberate through the centuries, like whispers among the stones of ancient cities and verses of Arabic poetry that dreamed of justice, yet lived beneath the weight of power. The man who took the reins of this new era was Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, governor of Syria and member of the powerful Umayyad tribe, the Banu Umayyah, who had once been opponents of the Prophet Muhammad, but later embraced Islam and rose to prominence. Muawiyah was shrewd, diplomatic, and deeply pragmatic. His conflict with Ali had divided the Ummah, but his political acumen secured him control after the Caliph's death. Upon assuming the Caliphate in 6061, Muawiyah moved the capital from Medina to Damascus, a city closer to imperial roots and endowed with sophisticated infrastructure inherited from Byzantine rule. This shift symbolized the transformation of the Caliphate from tribal and religious to an actual empire, with courts, bureaucracy, taxes, and defined borders. Muawiyah also broke precedent by introducing hereditary succession, naming his son Yazid as his successor. This decision sparked irreversible divisions. Many saw it as a betrayal of the egalitarian ideals of the early caliphs, and the opposition would manifest in tragic and lasting ways. The most defining moment came with the revolt of Hussein ibn Ali Shen, the Prophet's grandson, who refused to pledge allegiance to Yazid. In 680, Hussein and his small group of followers were surrounded on the plains of Karbala, in present-day Iraq. There they were massacred. Hussein fell, and with him was born the most painful symbol of the rupture between Sunni and Shia Islam. For the Shia, Karbala became an eternal lament, a cry for justice silenced by the sands. Despite the trauma, the Umayyad Caliphate continued its expansion. Under the rule of caliphs such as Abd al-Malik and al-Walid Fatu, the Islamic world reached staggering dimensions. From the Indus River to the mountains of the Iberian Peninsula, the banner of Islam rose with unprecedented speed. To govern such vastness, the Umayyads implemented sophisticated systems, standardized coinage, fiscal reforms, postal networks, and an increasingly Arabized administration. Arabic became the empire's official language, gradually replacing Greek, Persian, and other regional tongues in bureaucratic affairs. One of the most iconic expressions of Umayyad power was its architecture. In Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque was built, a marvel of art and spirituality, raised atop the ruins of an ancient Christian basilica. In Jerusalem, the magnificent Dome of the Rock, crowned with its golden dome, glistened beneath the sacred city's sky, becoming one of the most symbolic landmarks in the Islamic world. These structures were more than places of worship. They were visible proclamations of a new order, emblems of an empire that saw itself as the rightful inheritor of Muhammad's spiritual and political legacy. Yet beneath the surface of splendor, tensions simmered. The Umayyad administration favored Arab elites while marginalizing non-Arab converts to Islam, known as Mawali, who often faced social and fiscal discrimination. The universalist ideal of Islam, proclaiming the equality of all believers, clashed with a system of Arab dominance that resembled in many ways the empires it had once overthrown. Rebellions began to stir in the empire's eastern frontiers, especially in the region of Khorasan, where ethnic and economic tensions slowly fermented a revolutionary movement. This movement, skilled at channeling the grievances of non-Arabs and invoking the memory of the rightly guided caliphs, would erupt in 750, the Abbasid Revolution. Supported by Shia factions, Mawali, and other dissidents, defeated the Umayyads at the Battle of the Great Zab River, Seoul. The Umayyad Caliph, Marwan II, was killed, and most of the ruling family was exterminated. Only one young prince, Abd al-Rahman, managed to escape, crossing deserts and seas until reaching distant Al-Andalus, where he would establish a new Umayyad dynasty. But that is another story. The fall of the Umayyad Caliphate in the east did not erase its historical importance. It was under their rule that Islam ceased to be a regional faith and became a global civilization. It was through them that borders expanded, maps were redrawn, and the idea of a caliphate empire took solid form. Their achievements were vast, their failures profound. Between the Golden Dome of Jerusalem and the tears of Karbala, the Umayyad Caliphate was the mirror of its contradictions, magnificence and blood, faith and power. paradise and sword. And so, the stage was set for a new dynasty, one that promised the restoration of justice and spirituality, but would ultimately immerse Islam in an intellectual splendor never seen before. In the next chapter of our sleeping journey through history, we will open the gates of the Baghdad and witness the birth of a new dream, the Abbasid Caliphate, the House of Wisdom, and the golden dawn of science and philosophy. The year was 711. At the far western edge of the known world, beyond the restless waves of the Mediterranean and the red-tinged mountains of the Maghreb, lay a fertile land filled with Visigothic castles, ancient vineyards, and Roman cities now forgotten under the weight of centuries. The Iberian Peninsula, isolated between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pyrenees, was both a world apart and a crossroads of cultures. For the Muslim eyes watching from North Africa, it was a land of opportunity and destiny. The Caliphate, having crossed deserts and toppled empires, now gazed westward with curiosity and ambition. The crossing of Gibraltar was not merely a military incursion, it was the moment Islam met Europe, and history took on a new rhythm. Leading the crossing was a Berber commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad. It is said that upon landing on the rocky shores of southern Spain, he ordered his ships burned. Legend or truth, the image remains powerful. No return, no hesitation. Before them lay the lands of Hispania, ruled by a fractured Visigothic kingdom. King Roderick, newly crowned, faced opposition from local nobles, and though his army was large, it lacked cohesion. The decisive battle unfolded near the Guadalete River, where Tariq, commanding a much smaller force, employed precise tactics, exploiting the terrain, the winds of political disorder, and the spiritual fervor of his men to claim victory. Roderick vanished in the chaos of defeat, and with him, the last pillar of Visigothic monarchy crumbled. From there, the advance was swift. In just a few years, the major cities of the peninsula, Toledo, Córdoba, Seville, Mérida, Zaragoza, fell one after another. Some resisted bravely, others opened their gates, seeking protection or driven by pragmatism. The invaders were not only Arabs, many were newly Islamized Berbers, desert men, now walking among the olive trees of Andalusia. The Muslim conquest was fast, but the cultural transformation would take centuries. The new territory became known as Al-Andalus, a name that evoked mystery and promise. At first, Al-Andalus was administered as a western province of the Umayyad Caliphate, ruled from Damascus. But in 750, after the Abbasid revolution and the slaughter of the Umayyad family, a young survivor, Abd al-Rahman Samfan, crossed the Mediterranean and established himself in Córdoba, founding an independent emirate. It marked the beginning of a new era. Córdoba, under the exiled Umayyads, would flourish into one of the most splendid centers of the Islamic world. There, in the heart of Spain, a new civilization emerged, a synthesis of Greco-Roman knowledge, Arab tradition, Indian mathematics, Persian science, and Andalusian poetry. In Al-Andalus, mosques rose beside ancient churches. Public baths, libraries, and gardens multiplied. A relative tolerance among Muslims, Jews, and Christians gave rise to a rare multicultural environment in medieval times. Arabic became the language of culture, even for Christians. Jews, persecuted elsewhere in Europe, thrived in prosperous communities. The city of Toledo would later become one of the great centers of translation, transmitting classical knowledge to Christian Europe. It was as if an invisible bridge had been built between East and the coming Renaissance. Yet not all was harmony. Constant tensions simmered between Arabs and Berbers, between converts and conquerors, between local loyalties and imperial directives. Rebellions arose, and the power structure had to be constantly reinforced. Still, the cultural legacy grew strong. Architects built mosques with marble columns like forest canopies, such as the one in Córdoba. Poets like Awalida, daughter of a caliph, wrote verses of love and liberty. Philosophers such as Averroes, Ibn Rushd, reinterpreted Aristotle under the light of Islam. Astronomers mapped the stars. Physicians wrote treatises that would be read for centuries. In Al-Andalus, time seemed to breathe differently, as though past, present, and future had met beneath the palms and the libraries. The Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula would last nearly 8 centuries. The Christian Tryphia, Reconquista, began soon after the conquest in the northern mountains, but would take generations to gather momentum. Al-Andalus would fragment into kingdoms, the Taifas, and endure invasions from new North African empires like the Almoravids and Almohads. Each phase brought both brilliance and conflict. Yet the seed planted in 711 never stopped blooming, even when swords fell, even when palaces turned to ruins, even when the last Muslim stronghold, Granada Bay, was surrendered in 1492 to the Catholic monarchs, and the call to prayer fell silent in Iberian minarets. The conquest of the Iberian Peninsula was not just a military campaign. It marked the beginning of a cycle of exchange, fusion, and transformation that would shape not only Europe's history, but that of all humanity. In Al-Andalus, Islam encountered the West, and the West, in turn, was touched by the brilliance of Islam. It was a meeting point of worlds, where the sky of Spain reflected the stars of Arabia, and where memory still whispers, as night falls, the words of a past that refuses to die. And in the next stage of this journey through time, we will cross the sweeping plains of the East, where the Caliphate extended its frontiers into Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent, where Islam would meet new beliefs, new landscapes, and new riddles waiting to be unraveled. As the Caliphate extended its roots across Africa and Europe like the branches of a vast tree, a new direction began to call to the eyes of strategists, merchants, and missionaries: the East. Beyond the rugged mountains of Persia and the golden rivers of Mesopotamia lay a mysterious expanse dotted with oasis cities, silent caravans, and kingdoms with millennia-old traditions. This was Central Asia, land of the Sogdians, Scythians, Bactrians, and other peoples who lived among deserts, steppes, and fertile valleys. Farther still stretched the Indian subcontinent, a mosaic of kingdoms, languages, and philosophies, where Islam would find, not through the sword alone, but also through the touch of spirit, a new home. The Eastern conquest began after the collapse of the Sassanid Empire, when the gates of Persia were thrown open by the Arab advance. From the region of Khorasan, now split among Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkmenistan, the Caliphate's armies encountered a world unknown, yet not unfriendly. Cities like Merv, Nishapur, Bukhara, and Samarkand had flourished for centuries as strategic hubs of the Silk Road, the immense network of trade and culture linking the Mediterranean to China, the Alps to the invisible wall of the Himalayas. There, among hand-woven carpets, Aramaic manuscripts, and mud-brick towers, Islam encountered more than resistance. It found exchange and acceptance. The military campaigns were intense, to be sure. Sogdian resistance, led by local kings and backed by ancient cultures, put up fierce battles. The mountains of Transoxiana do not yield easily, nor do their fortresses fall in silence. Yet the Islamic policy of offering relative autonomy in exchange for tribute, the jizya, allowed many local rulers to accept new overlords without widespread destruction. The Caliphate's generals, many of them born outside Arabia, began to blend the strength of arms with the diplomacy of words. But what truly defined the Eastern expansion was the role of local converts, who quickly rose to join, and even lead, the Islamic administration. Unlike the early decades of Islam, when Arab supremacy dominated, the East brought a new reality. Islam would no longer be only Arab. It would become Persian, Turkic, Indian, and beyond. Conversion in the East was not just a religious act, it was a cultural, intellectual, and social transformation. The Quran began to be interpreted through Persian philosophy. Arabic lived alongside Persian and Sogdian, and the names of the first caliphs echoed through brick madrasas and blue-tiled minarets. Farther south, toward the valley of the Indus River, a new front of expansion opened. India, land of countless deities, ancient temples, and rigid castes, posed a unique challenge and a powerful promise. Islam entered the subcontinent primarily through the region of Sindh, today part of Pakistan, where Hindu rulers held strong fortresses and sophisticated administrations. In 711, the same year that Tariq crossed into Spain, another young commander set out on a fateful journey, Muhammad ibn Qasim. At just 17 years old, Muhammad ibn Qasim led an expedition sent by the governor of Iraq against the kingdom of Sind, ruled by Raja Dahir. The reasons were political and commercial, but also spiritual, to secure the maritime routes of the Persian Gulf and open a path for Islam among the ports of the Indian Ocean. The campaign was harsh, but victorious. After taking the fortress of Dabal, now Karachi, Muhammad advanced upriver, defeating Dahir's forces and establishing Muslim control in the region. Temples were not destroyed. Instead, treaties were signed with local elites, and Hindu and Buddhist populations were allowed to maintain their religions under the tribute system. Though geographically limited, this conquest would have immense consequences. For the first time, Islam planted roots in a civilization profoundly different. In the centuries to come, Islamic dynasties would arise across India, from the Delhi Sultanate to the vast Mughal Empire. But the foundation for it all was laid in that early meeting between Quran and Vedas, between desert and Ganges, between mosque and mandir. The dialogue, sometimes violent, sometimes peaceful, between Islam and India, would give rise to one of the richest and most complex cultural fusions in human history. And while armies crossed valleys, merchants sailed the seas. Ports like Basra, Hormuz, Muscat, and Calicut became constant points of contact between Arabs, Indians, Malays, and Chinese. Islam expanded not only by the sword, but by the sail. The monsoon winds carried the call to prayer to the shores of Ceylon and the islands of today's Indonesia. And with it came a way of life, a moral code, a worldview that would blossom in distant lands, under skies and palms that had never known the desert. Thus, in the East, Islam met not only resistance and acceptance, but mutual transformation. And the Caliphate, now more multicultural than ever, needed reorganization. More than weapons, it needed wisdom. In the next stage of this journey, we will leave the plains and the frontiers and enter the heart of a new empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, where words would wield as much power as swords, and where books would illuminate more than blades. Every empire, no matter how vast, carries within it the seeds of its own end, and the Umayyad Caliphate, which for decades stretched its dominion from the Atlantic to the Indus, from Al-Andalus to the borders of China, was no exception. Brilliant in its conquests and monumental in its works, it also silently nurtured the contradictions that would erode it from within. The very vastness that was once its greatest glory slowly became a burden too heavy to bear. And among the scrolls of the courts, the corridors of mosques, and the whispers of marketplaces, a growing unrest began to rise, one that would soon ignite into revolution. The Umayyad administration, centered in Damascus, was distinctly Arab in its composition and favoritism. The Mawali, non-Arab converts to Islam, including Persians, Turks, Berbers, and others, though professing the same faith, were often treated as second class. They paid taxes that Arabs did not, were excluded from administrative roles, and were regarded with suspicion by the Caliphate's elite. The promise of Islam, equality among believers, seemed lost in the reality of an empire that increasingly resembled the dynasties it had once vanquished. This tension, silent for decades, ripened like fruit under the harsh sun of injustice. At the same time, the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad's family, the Banu Hashim, harbored deep resentments. Many saw the Banu Umayyad as usurpers of the Caliphate, responsible for tragedies such as the martyrdom of Hussein at Karbala, a memory that still bled within Shia communities. The belief that the Caliphate should return to the Prophet's lineage, or at least to a more just and spiritual leadership, gained strength, particularly in the eastern lands of Khorasan, where Persians and other peoples had embraced Islam fervently, yet remained on the margins of power. It was there, among the mountains and plains of eastern Iran, that a movement began to germinate, one that would alter the course of history. Led by a mysterious man named Abu Muslim, a charismatic orator and strategist, the Abbasid movement forged alliances among the discontented, Shiites, Mawali, Persian nationalists, and even Sunnis yearning for social justice. In 747, The black banner of revolution was raised in Merv, marking the beginning of open rebellion against the Umayyads. The Abbasid armies, driven by faith and the dream of a new world, began their march toward the Caliphate's heart. The Umayyad response came late and disorganized. In 750, Abbasid forces clashed with the Umayyads in the Battle of the Great Zab River in Mesopotamia. It was a fierce, decisive, and symbolic confrontation. The Umayyad Caliph Marwan II, defeated, fled to Egypt, where he was eventually captured and killed. In a ruthless sweep, most of the Umayyad family was executed, an attempt to erase the dynasty entirely. Only one young prince, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah, escaped the slaughter, crossing desert and sea to find refuge in distant Al-Andalus, where he would establish a new Umayyad dominion, a persistent flame in the Abbasid night. With the revolution's victory, the Abbasids assumed the caliphate, proclaiming a new era of justice, knowledge, and spirituality. Their first caliph, Abu al-Abbas as-Safa, earned the name the Bloodshedder for the ruthless manner in which he consolidated power. But it was his successor, Al-Mansur, who laid the foundations of a new empire. Instead of Damascus, the Abbasids built a new capital, Baghdad, on the banks of the Tigris River, a city crafted from scratch to be the center of the Muslim world. With its circular walls, irrigated gardens, and expanding libraries, Baghdad would soon become more than a city. It would become a symbol. The rise of the Abbasids marked a radical shift in the nature of the caliphate. What had once been a military empire of conquest became an empire of ideas, letters, and science. Though power remained centralized, it drew on Persian traditions of court and administration. The Arabic language became a vessel for Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Egyptian medicine. In Baghdad, the legendary House of Wisdom emerged, where scholars of all backgrounds translated and interpreted the works of Aristotle, Plato, Hippocrates, and Galen, merging classical knowledge with Islamic horizons. But even amid this dawn of knowledge, challenges remained. The empire's vastness, internal disputes, regional uprisings, and sectarian tensions did not disappear. Over time, the caliphate's authority would be contested by local powers, independent dynasties, and alternative Islamic governments. The political unity of Islam would never again be absolute. Even so, the fall of the Umayyads and the rise of the Abbasids signified more than a change of power. It marked the transition from a world of swords to a world of words, from an empire of borders to an empire of thought. And in the quiet dawns of Baghdad, as calligraphers dipped their brushes in ink and astronomers traced the stars, Islam found a new path, not only of conquest, but of contemplation. In the next chapter of this dreamlike journey, we will enter the brilliance of the Islamic Golden Age, where science, art, and philosophy walked hand in hand, and where faith expressed itself through the light of knowledge. When the first rays of morning spilled over the domes of Baghdad, reflecting in the waters of the Tigris like strokes of liquid gold, there was more in that light than the simple start of a new day. There was the glow of a civilization at the height of its thought, spirit, and beauty. The capital of the Babarisa, Abbasids, founded in the 8th century as an ambitious, almost utopian project, would soon become the beating heart of the Islamic world, and, for a brief and precious moment in human history, the beacon of science, philosophy, medicine, and art for the entire planet. It was the dawn of the Islamic Golden Age, a period in which the pursuit of knowledge was viewed as a sacred duty, and where faith did not oppose reason but walked hand in hand with it, like twin stars crossing the same sky. The Caliph, Harun al-Rashid, whose name still echoes in the tales of 1001 Nights, was the great patron of this era. During his reign, Baghdad reached unmatched sophistication, with palaces adorned in glass mosaics, fountains whispering through warm nights, and libraries that housed more manuscripts than any other place in the world. Harun was a man of faith, but also of culture. In his court, he welcomed not only Muslim scholars, but also Jews, Nestorian Christians, Hindus, and Zoroastrians, a cosmopolitan intellectual environment that seemed to foreshadow a humanity united by knowledge. His son, Al-Mamun, continued this legacy with a special passion for knowledge. He founded the legendary Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, where translators, mathematicians, philosophers, astronomers, and physicians worked side by side, translating and reinterpreting the wisdom of antiquity. There the works of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Hippocrates, Ptolemy, and many others were translated from Greek, Syriac, and Persian into Arabic. But it wasn't just about translation. It was about reinvention, creative dialogue, and the expansion of human thought. Mathematics flourished with figures like Al-Khwarizmi, whose treatises gave birth to the concept of algebra, al-jabr, and whose name would inspire the term algorithm, so central to the digital world we live in today. Astronomy reached new heights with al-Battani and al-Farghani, who precisely calculated the Earth's diameter and corrected Ptolemaic data. In medicine, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, produced his masterpiece, the Canon of Medicine, used for centuries in European universities. Alchemy, precursor to chemistry, took form through Jabir ibn Hayyan, who experimented with substances, developed distillation techniques, and classified elements with a rigor that prefigured modern laboratories. Then came the my philosophers, thinkers such as Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and Avicenna, who delved into the mysteries of being, soul, time, and causality. They translated not only words but ideas, confronting and harmonizing the teachings of Aristotle and Plato with the principles of the Quran. In their hands, philosophy was not heresy, but contemplation, not the enemy of faith, but its elder sister. Islam in those days did not fear thought, it celebrated it. This flowering was not confined to Baghdad. In Cordoba, in Al-Andalus, the light of this renaissance shone with equal brilliance. The city, under the exiled Umayyads, rivaled Baghdad in splendor. It had paved streets, hospitals, schools, and one of the largest libraries in the Islamic world. Jews there experienced a golden age of their own, with figures like Maimonides, who conversed with Averroes and reinterpreted scripture through the lens of reason. Knowledge flowed across seas and deserts, from the libraries of Cairo to the madrasas of Samarkand, from the observatories of Damascus to the markets of Basra, where manuscripts were traded like spices. Poetry also bloomed as never before. Poets like Al-Mutanabi, Rabia al-Adawiyya, Omar Khayyam, and many others gave voice to mystical love, existential longing, the fleeting beauty of life, and the depth of the soul. Their verses, written in calligraphy as beautiful as their meaning, adorned palace walls and the hearts of pilgrims. Sufism, the spiritual current seeking direct experience of the divine, also found expression, with masters who turned contemplation into dance, silence into prayer, and the inner journey into poetry. But not all was harmony. The empire's grandeur demanded constant vigilance. Regional revolts, sectarian tensions between Sunnis, Shiites, and other groups, succession disputes, and external threats began to shake the caliphate's foundations. Yet, for centuries, even amid division and instability, the pursuit of knowledge never ceased. The medieval Islamic civilization proved to the world that faith and reason are not enemies, and that a society can reach the pinnacle of thought, even in politically turbulent times. And then, as twilight fell upon this golden age, as the winds of history brought Mongol invasions, the fragmentation of power, and crusaders from afar, the legacy had already been cast. Islam had absorbed the knowledge of the ancient world, reimagined it, enriched it, and eventually transmitted it to medieval Europe. When the European Renaissance blossomed, it did so with roots planted by Arab, Persian, and Andalusian hands. In the next chapter of this journey that cradles the mind as the eyes close, we will enter the world of regional caliphates, fragments of a once unified empire striving to keep the flame of knowledge and faith alive amid the collapse of political unity. We will witness the brief but brilliant light of the Caliphate of Cordoba, the mystery of the Fatimid Caliphate, and the ever-fracturing outlines of a world in transformation. As the centuries passed, the vastness of the Islamic Caliphate, once thought invincible, began to buckle under the weight of its own dimensions. The unity once proclaimed from mosque pulpits and sealed by the voices of Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad gave way to inevitable fragmentation. It was as if a mirror had shattered into dozens of shards, each reflecting the original light in its own way. Yet even as politics fractured, Islamic civilization continued to pulse, now through multiple centers of power, art, and spirituality. In this new multipolar world, two regional caliphates emerged with unique brilliance: the Qamar Caliphate of Cordoba, in the far western reaches of Al-Andalus, and the Fatimid Caliphate Famar, in the heart of Egypt. In the west, after the Umayyads had fallen in Damascus, a surviving prince, Abd al-Rahman II, crossed deserts and seas to establish a new emirate in Al-Andalus, far from Abbasid reach. For decades, his descendants ruled Cordoba as independent emirs. But in 929, facing rising Fatimid threats and the disunity of Christian kingdoms in the north, Abd al-Rahman III declared himself caliph, not merely a political leader, but a spiritual one as well. It was a bold claim that the Islamic world was no longer centered in just one place. The caliphate now had an Andalusian voice. Under the Umayyads of Cordoba, Al-Andalus flourished as never before. The city became one of the largest in Europe, with public baths, libraries, hospitals, markets, gardens, and over 70,000 illuminated houses. The famed Mosque of Cordoba, with its columns like stone palm trees, symbolized the aesthetic and spiritual refinement of an Islam fused with Iberian, Roman, and Visigothic traditions. It was a civilization of encounters between Arabic and Latin, the Quran and Aristotle, the carpet and the mosaic. And although politics were complex, marked by internal tensions, intellectual production thrived. It was there that Averroes and Maimonides contemplated the world. It was there that music, medicine, and architecture found new meaning. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Islamic world, another caliphate was rising: the Fatimids. Followers of the Ismaili Shiasi tradition claimed direct descent from Fatima, daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. For their followers, the world needed a true spiritual leader, an imam, to unite faith and reason. In 909, they seized power in North Africa and founded their caliphate, initially centered in Mahdia, in present-day Tunisia. But their most defining moment came in 969, when they conquered Egypt and founded the city of Al-Qahira, the victorious, now known as Cairo. Cairo quickly became one of the most important centers in Islam. The Fatimids built splendid mosques, including Al-Azhar, which soon became one of the foremost religious institutions in the Islamic world, a beacon that still shines to this day. The Fatimid administration was centralized, refined, and open to diversity. Jews, Christians, and Sunnis found roles in the economic and cultural life of the city, even under a Shia-led caliphate. It was as if, despite theological divisions, Muslims upheld the tradition of coexistence and the pursuit of knowledge. Yet this era of parallel caliphates was not without tension. The existence of multiple leaders claiming supreme authority over Muslims challenged the spiritual unity of the Ummah. Preachers clashed from pulpits. Jurists diverged in their rulings. Ideological rivalries between the Sunni Abbasids, Shia Fatimids, and Umayyads of Cordoba blended with geopolitical disputes over trade routes, tribal alliances, and regional influence. On paper, there were three caliphates. In practice, dozens of local powers balanced faith, culture, and the sword. Over time, both the Cordoba and Fatimid caliphates would face the same fate as all empires: decline. The Andalusian caliphate would fragment into small kingdoms known as taifas, vulnerable to Christian offensives from the north and plagued by internal rivalries. Its splendor would give way to division, and Cordoba, once rivaling Baghdad, would see its arches fall silent under the weight of history. The Fatimid Caliphate, weakened by internal strife and rising military powers like the Seljuk Turks, would eventually be absorbed by the Ayyubids, under the legendary Salah ad-Din, Saladin. Thus, the regional caliphates revealed to the Islamic world that spiritual unity no longer equated to political unity. Islam had become a civilization of multiple centers: Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, Samarkand, Nishapur, each radiating light, culture, faith, and science in its own way. The map was no longer linear, it had become constellational. In the next stage of this sleeping journey, we will enter even more turbulent times. The Crusades appear on the horizon like thunder from the west, and the Mongols advance from the east like an unstoppable storm. We will witness how the Islamic world faced these devastating external threats, and how, even amid collapse and fire, faith and wisdom struggled to endure. When the church bells rang across Europe in the late 11th century, announcing the call to arms to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim hands, the Islamic world entered a new era, one of tension, bloodshed, and resilience. The crusading winds came from the north and west, sweeping across the deserts and valleys of the Middle East like a storm heralded by drums and crosses. At the same time, from the east, an even more brutal and swifter threat was forming. The horsemen of the steppes, the Bakasta Mongols, were forging an empire upon the bones of ancient nations. It was as if the extremes of the world, Christian and pagan, met at the gates of Islam, challenging not just its stability, but its very soul. And the caliphate, already fractured into regional caliphates, sultanates, and emirates, now had to resist not only internal divisions, but the advance of entire civilizations that saw Islam either as an obstacle or a prize. The Crusades, though told in the Western tradition as epic journeys of faith, were for the Islamic world bloody and unpredictable invasions. When Pope Urban II in 1095 summoned the kings of Christendom to retake Jerusalem, the news rippled through Europe like a spiritual earthquake. Multitudes marched eastward, driven by promises of salvation, wealth, and glory. For Islam, the arrival of the Crusaders was initially a shock. The Muslim world was divided. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was increasingly symbolic, while Egypt was under the Shia Fatimid rule. Jerusalem, in this fractured context, was a jewel caught between rival powers. In 1099, after a brutal siege, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem and massacred its Muslim and Jewish population. Blood ran through the streets of the holy city, and the minarets fell silent for centuries. It was the deepest wound, the most symbolic blow, but it was not the end. The Islamic world began to react. At first, in scattered efforts. Later, more organized responses took shape. Among them, one name rose like a star above the dust of the battlefield: Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. Interestingly, of Kurdish origin, Saladin not only unified Egypt and Syria under his rule, but also won the hearts of Muslims, and even some Europeans, for his nobility, justice, and refined military strategy. In 1187, he led the Battle of Hattin, defeating the Crusaders and reclaiming Jerusalem. Yet unlike what had happened under Christian conquest, Saladin allowed the inhabitants to leave safely, preserving their rights and places of worship. Slowly, the West's perception of Muslims began to shift. Meanwhile, Islam rediscovered its moral strength in the chaos of war. As the western front of the Islamic world reshaped itself through battles and fragile truces with Crusader states, another, quieter and even more devastating threat rose from the east. In the early 13th century, from the frozen steppes of Central Asia, came the thunder of hooves. It was Genghis Khan, lord of the Mongols, who in just a few decades would build the largest contiguous land empire in history. The Mongols did not come with crosses or treaties. They came with fire, arrows, and merciless speed. Their march respected no walls, no religions, no diplomacy. The first blow fell upon the cities of Central Asia: Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, centers of Islamic culture that now burned in flames. In 1258 came the most devastating strike. The armies of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, laid siege to the legendary city of Baghdad. The Abbasid capital, the intellectual and spiritual heart of Islam for centuries, was obliterated in a bloodbath. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands were killed, and that the books of the House of Wisdom were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantity that it is said the waters ran black with ink for days. The last Abbasid caliph was trampled to death. For many, that marked the end of the Islamic world as it had been known. But history is also made of rebirths. After the initial fury, the Mongols transformed. Many embraced Islam, founding dynasties that later helped restore part of the lost brilliance. The Ilkhanids in Iran and the Timurids in Central Asia became patrons of the arts, architecture, and astronomy. Islam, though wounded, reinvented itself in new forms and faces. The memory of Baghdad now lived on in the madrasas of Cairo, the mosques of Damascus, the observatories of Marageh, and the mystical verses of Darumi. The legacy of this dark period was paradoxical. The Fiasmat, the Crusades, had shown that, even fragmented, the Islamic world could resist, regroup, and defend its values. The Fiyas, Mongol invasion, though it shattered illusions of invulnerability, also carried Islam farther. To India, Indonesia, the Caucasus, and China, pain forged new alliances, new schools of thought, and new paths forward. And so, as minarets were rebuilt among the ruins, and caravans once again crossed the desert, bearing silk, paper, and manuscripts, a new age quietly announced itself. No longer a single unified caliphate, but a living network of Muslim cultures connected by faith, science, trade, and memory. In the next and final stage of this long journey through time, we will contemplate the enduring legacy of Islamic conquests, not as territorial dominance, but as a spiritual, scientific, and cultural heritage that still lives on in cities, libraries, languages, and the dreams of people around the world. There are echoes that cross centuries, silences that speak louder than words. And there are civilizations that, even stripped of their empires, continue to live, not on maps, but in ideas, in gestures, in languages, in ways of thinking and dreaming. The Islamic world, which over the centuries expanded like a living tapestry between desert and sea, between Asia and Africa, from Al-Andalus to China, left marks that time cannot erase. Even though the caliphates have crumbled, even though the palaces have turned to ruins and the names of caliphs fade into dusty chronicles, the legacy of Islamic conquests continues to pulse quietly in the soul of humanity. Perhaps the most profound of these legacies is the very idea of pluralistic civilization. At its most expansive, Islam did not destroy what it encountered. On the contrary, it absorbed, translated, combined, and reinvented. Greek philosophy, Persian medicine, Indian mathematics, Chaldean astronomy, African poetry, Byzantine art, all were welcomed, studied, debated, and elevated into new forms. The houses of wisdom, the translation centers, the madrasas, and the mosques were not just places of faith, they were beacons of thought, where believers and non-believers, Arabs and non-Arabs, men and women, could reach toward the infinite through knowledge. This intellectual heritage, which blossomed especially under the Abbasids, did not vanish with the collapse of the Caliphate. It was passed on, quietly, to the libraries of Byzantium, the monasteries of Europe, the Jewish scholars of Toledo, and the Italian monks of the 13th century. When Europe awakened to the Renaissance, many of the books that lit that new fire had been preserved and enhanced by Muslim hands. Islam did not merely preserve the knowledge of the ancient world, it recreated it, and returned it to the world clearer, broader, deeper. But the legacy of conquest is not confined to knowledge. It is also inscribed in the political and social structures of many modern countries. Systems of justice, taxation, urban planning, hydraulic engineering, trade routes, all were shaped by centuries of Islamic governance across regions that today form dozens of nations, from Central Asia to North Africa, from the Iberian Peninsula to Indonesia. And though the empires dissolved, the traces remain in the layout of cities, in street names, in everyday customs, in family values, in the calendar still marked by the birth of the new moon. In architecture, the legacy stands like petrified poetry. The arches of Cordoba, the tiles of Isfahan, the domes of Samarkand, the fountains of Damascus, the walls of Jerusalem, the minarets of Mecca and Medina, all tell stories of beauty and faith, of silence and geometry, of light curving between shadows. These spaces, built to elevate the soul, still move travelers and scholars alike, believers and seekers, because they were designed to touch something beyond the physical, the sacred that dwells within us all. Culturally, Islam shaped worlds. It influenced languages, clothing, cuisine, dances, tales, and songs. The poetry of Art Rumi still soothes hearts on cold Eastern nights. The tales of 1001 Nights still enchant young and old minds. The Quran, recited since the 7th century, still echoes with the same cadence in mosques, homes, and deserts. The call to prayer 5 times a day is the invisible thread that stitches together millions of lives in a shared quest for the divine, the silent, the eternal. And then there is the spiritual and philosophical legacy, perhaps the most intimate of all. Islam was never merely an empire. It was, and still is, a path, a way of being in the world, an invitation to humility, generosity, discipline, and compassion. The 5 pillars, Shahada, Salat, Zakat, Psalm, Hajj, continue to shape lives amid modern noise. The teachings of Muhammad, the sayings of the Imams, the commentaries of the scholars are still studied, memorized, debated, and reinterpreted. Islam taught millions that faith can be a way of life, not just a belief, but a daily practice of harmony between body, mind, and soul. Even internal conflicts between Sunnis and Shiites, between legal schools, between the Orthodox and the mystics, left behind a rare theological and cultural diversity. Far from being a weakness, this plurality allowed Islam to survive the fiercest storms of history: invasions, crusades, colonization, secularization. And even today, in every corner of the world, Muslim communities continue to reinvent faith, sometimes in silence, sometimes out loud, sometimes in longing, sometimes in hope. In the end, the legacy of Islamic conquests is living proof that an idea can cross millennia. From the deserts of Arabia, where Muhammad's message was born, came not just a book, but a civilization. And though the caliphs have passed, the empires have fallen, and the wars have left scars, the idea remains. The idea that knowledge is light, that faith is a bridge, that justice is a path, and that the human soul, wherever it is born, can seek the same sky. And so we end this journey through centuries of history, guided by sand and star, by sword and book, by mosque and market. A time of conquests, yes, but above all, a time of creation, transmission, imagination. The caliphate may have ended, but its echo, that echo does not fade. Good night, traveler of time. May sleep carry you gently, like caravans beneath moonlight, and may your dreams guide you through the invisible roads of the past, where ancient voices still whisper wisdom to souls that know how to listen.